and each time that Josephine looked back she marvelled at the man behind her, bareheaded, his hair drenched, his arms naked to the elbows, and his clear gray eyes always smiling confidence at her through the gloom of mist. Not until darkness was falling about them did Jean drop near enough to speak again. Then he shouted: "Another hour and we reach Snowbird River, M'sieur. That is 4 miles from Adare House. But ahead of us the wind rushes across a wide sweep of the lake. Shall we hazard it?" "Yes, yes!" cried the girl, answering for Philip. "We must go on!" Without another word Croisset led the way. The wind grew stronger with each minute's progress. Shouting for Jean to hold his canoe for a space, Philip steadied his own canoe while he spoke to the girl. "Come back to me as quietly as you can, Josephine," he said. "Pass the dunnage ahead of you to take the place of your weight. If anything happens I want you near me." Cautiously Josephine did as he bade her, and as she added slowly to the ballast in the bow she drew little by little nearer to Philip. Her hand touched an object in the bottom of the canoe as she came close to him. It was one of his moccasins. She saw now his naked throat and chest. He had stripped off his heavy woolen shirt as well as his footwear. He reached out, and his hand touched her lightly as she huddled down in front of him. "Splendid!" he laughed. "You're a little brick, Josephine, and the best comrade in a canoe that I ever saw. Now if we go over all I've got to do is to swim ashore with you. Is it good walking to Adare House?" He did not hear her reply, but a fresh burst of the wind sent a loose strand of her hair back into his face, and he was happy. Happy in spite of a peril which neither he nor Jean would have thought of facing alone. In the darkness he could no longer see Croisset or his canoe, but Jean's shouts came back to him every minute on the wind, and over Josephine's head he answered. He was glad that it was so dark the girl could not see what was ahead of them now. Once or twice his own breath stopped short, when it seemed that the canoe had taken the fatal plunge which he was dreading. Every minute he figured the distance from the shore and his chances of swimming it if they were overturned. And then, after a long time, there came a sudden lull in the wind, and the seas grew less rough. Jean's voice came from near them, filled with a thrill of relief. "We are behind the point," he shouted. "Another mile we will enter the Snowbird, M'sieur." Philip leaned forward in the gloom. Josephine's cap had fallen off, and for a moment his hand rested on her wet and wind blown hair. "Did you hear that?" he cried. "We're almost home." "Yes," she shivered. "And I am glad glad." Was it an illusion of his own, or did she seem to shiver and draw away from him at the touch of his hand? Even in the blackness he could feel that she was huddled forward, her face in her hands. She did not speak to him again. When they entered the smooth water of the Snowbird, Jean's canoe drew close in beside them, but not a word fell from Croisset. Like shadows they moved up the stream between two black walls of forest. A steadily increasing excitement, a feeling that he was upon the eve of strange events, grew stronger in Philip. His arms and back ached. His legs were cramped. The last of his splendid strength had been called upon in the fight with wind and seas, but he forgot this exhaustion in anticipation of the hour that was drawing near. He knew that Adare House would reveal to him things which Josephine had not told him. She said that it would, and that he would hate her then. That they were burying themselves deeper into the forest he guessed by the lessening of the wind. Half an hour passed, and in that time his companion did not move or speak. He heard faintly a distant wailing cry. He recognized the sound. It was not a wolf cry, but the howl of a husky. He fancied then that the girl moved, that she was gripping the sides of the canoe with her hands. For 15 minutes more there was not a sound but the dip of the paddles and the monotone of the wind sweeping through the forest tops. Then the dog howled again, much nearer, and this time he was joined by a second, a third, and a fourth, until the night was filled with a din that made Philip stare wonderingly off into the blackness. There were 50 dogs if there was one in that yelping, howling horde, he told himself, and they were coming with the swiftness of the wind in their direction. From his canoe Croisset broke the silence. "The wind has given the pack our scent, Ma Josephine, and they are coming to meet you," he said. The girl made no reply, but Philip could see now that she was sitting tense and erect. As suddenly as it had begun the cry of the pack ceased. The dogs had reached the water, and were waiting. Not until Jean swung his canoe toward shore and the bow of it scraped on a gravelly bar did they give voice again, and then so close and fiercely that involuntarily Philip held his canoe back. In another moment Josephine had stepped lightly over the side in a foot of water. He could not see what happened then, except that the bar was filled with a shadowy horde of leaping, crowding, yelping beasts, and that Josephine was the centre of them. He heard her voice clear and commanding, crying out their names, Tyr, Captain, Bruno, Thor, Wamba, until their number seemed without end. He heard the metallic snap of fangs, quick, panting breaths, the shuffling of padded feet, and then the girl's voice grew more clear, and the sounds less, until he heard nothing but the bated breath of the pack and a low, smothered whine. In that moment the wind blown clouds above them broke in a narrow rift across the skies, and for an instant the moon shone through. What he saw then drew Philip's breath from him in a wondering gasp. On the white bar stood Josephine. The wind on the lake had torn the strands of her long braids loose, and her hair swept in a damp and clinging mass to her hips. She was looking toward him as if about to speak. But it was the pack that made him stare. A sea of great, shaggy heads and crouching bodies surrounded her. A fierce yellow and green eyed horde, flattened like a single beast upon their bellies, their heads turned toward her, their throats swelling, and their eyes gleaming in the joyous excitement of her return. An instant of that strange and thrilling picture, and the night was black again. The girl's voice spoke softly. Bodies shuffled out of her path, and then she said, quite near to him, "Are you coming, Philip?" Chapter 7